Little show of hands, how many of you go to daily Mass? How many of you strive to go to daily Mass? That's maybe easier to do it that way. All right. Really funny thing, you know what the church teaches about daily Mass, right? Most important thing you can do, it's the be-all and end-all, the everything. If I told you I would give you $100 for every daily Mass you attended, but only if you attended Mass for 365 days this year, how many of you now would go to every daily Mass despite being sick? How about if I upped it to $1,000? Show of hands, $1,000 for every Mass you attend, as long as you did 365. Doesn't matter if you're sick or not. All right, 10,000. Come on. Really? Okay, you guys are not wanting to be millionaires. But the point is, the church does teach that one Mass is of infinite value. You read some of the saints talking about the value of the Mass. They talk about coming back to live a life of utter suffering so they could attend one Mass. The man on your screen is a very special man in my life. He's my dad. Yes, I know, he's a white guy with blue eyes. Yes, I am a mix, and so therefore, he's actually my biological father. But he was one of those guys. Daily Mass, daily rosary kind of guys. And he was so daily Mass, so daily rosary kind of guy that he drove a lot of people crazy. His own family, meaning his mom and his siblings, they really couldn't get over the fact that when he was a visa officer for Canada, he would go around the world helping people come into the country. When they were poor, he'd let them stay at his house. It was his house, but his mom and his sister also lived there. That was awkward for them. When they were really poor and they finally found a place for themselves, sometimes he'd give away some of his furniture. And they didn't like that. They said he was crazy. A lot of his colleagues thought he was nuts too, because after he got married, he didn't want to travel all over the world, so he worked for the Catholic Children's Aid. And we live in Canada, and the Catholic is just a moniker for, you know, it's another children's aid, but this one sort of associated somehow with the faith. But nobody actually practices it, except for my dad. It was, well, it's the Catholic Children's Aid, we should be teaching the faith, and so all his colleagues mocked him. I hate to tell you, but it's true. I left the faith in my early teens, and I mocked this great, great man. I remember going clubbing, sometimes till 2 and 3 in the morning. I'd come home, and there he'd be kneeling at his bedside, sometimes having fallen asleep. I remember him getting a haircut from my aunt, and Dad prayed constantly. He actually never stopped, I don't think. So if he was getting a haircut, of course, he was lips moving, nothing, no sound coming out. But my aunt knew what he was doing. She got to the front of him and hit him and said, "Can you never stop?" The answer was no. But that was my dad. And you know, when I fell away from the faith, I had to fake it. I went to Mass on Sundays, grabbed the bulletin, and came back with it so I could show him. Of course, I went to play pool after. But it was nevertheless something I knew I couldn't get away with. And when I did sort of more formally leave and abandon the faith, it was only my dad that brought me back. In fact, I'm going to tell you how and why. You see, I got into a life of horrible sin, and it might have been cool on the outside, but it was hell on the inside. But what brought me back, actually, was True Devotion to Mary. How many of you know that book? De Montfort's work, True Devotion to Mary. It's a very important book, actually. Germans called it Das Goldene Buch. And yes, he was German, and I speak German. But it's because it is such a treasure. Father was explaining that the book was found only after a long time in a chest. Because de Montfort predicted that would happen. St. Louis de Montfort said that the demons would tear it up. So when it was found without a front page, so no title, so nobody knew what to call it. That's why it's known as different titles: True Devotion, Treatise on True Devotion, etc., etc. Well, I found this book, and it did help me in my conversion, except right before that, it caused the greatest crisis of faith in my life. Because when I read the book, in my life at that point, I was ready for the Catholic Lucky Charm. I was going, okay, my life sucks. I'm ready to give up 1 hour on Sunday mornings so I can get the Catholic Lucky Charm. And it didn't work so well. I couldn't believe I was still doing what I was doing because I didn't have control over myself. I had ceded control to another entity, which is very powerful, more powerful than all of us. And so, when I read True Devotion, I had a crisis of faith. I realized that all during my fallen away years, I had told myself, God doesn't exist. Jesus doesn't exist. It wouldn't fit with what I was doing. And so, when I realized True Devotion means all day, every day, all night, it's your whole life, you're giving it away. Not that I necessarily thought it was a bad thing, because the life of faith I could see from those practicing it was actually a good thing, but I wasn't going to do that if it wasn't real. And that's what I didn't know. So I got the book, literally put it under my arm, and went to my dad. Because the only thing I knew in life was that he loved me, and he wasn't going to steer me wrong. So I got to my dad, and I had this whole little speech prepared. Dad, I only know one thing in life. That's you love me. Because you love me, I want you to tell me the truth. I read your book, and it means giving away my whole life, and I don't want to do that if it's not real. So tell me, Dad, is it real? And I could never ask him that question. I was standing in front of him and couldn't ask him that question because he had already given the answer. You know what the answer was? The answer was his own life of faith. The answer was particularly the suffering and persecution he'd received from his friends, his family, his colleagues, and from me. Because that answer spoke louder than any word he could have said. And that was the means of bringing me from a life of hell into a life of grace. And that is the answer for all of you. As Dr. Child said, I could end the talk now, but I've got an hour left, so there's more to say. But that is the answer. The answer is live your life holily. And it will be the answer to all of those around you. That was my dad's answer. And it led me from a life of sin where I would be dead and in hell right now to a life that I absolutely don't deserve. I fell away when I was about 14 years old. I came back to the church when I was 22, 23. I was graced to found an organization called LifeSite News. It went from literally nothing to, as you heard, we have about 60 million page views a year. We went from 2 people who started it, myself and Steve Jalsavak, to a team now of over 40 people. This is even an older photo. It led me to meet the greatest people on earth. Good, holy folks all around the world. To work with the church and literally to meet saints. And yep, it has working with the Vatican even as late as 2013. But I'll tell you the greatest blessing, next to our Lord himself, which came with the package of his Holy Mother, is something that I totally don't deserve. And it's this. I have a beautiful family with 8 children and a wife who shares my faith and brings that faith to our kids. As Father Couture said, we should always start with something. But the title of the talk here is about giving answers. You've already got the real answer. Live your own holy life. But in 1 Peter 3:15 we read, But sanctify the Lord Christ in your hearts, being ready always to satisfy everyone that asketh you a reason of that hope which is in you. You've got to be ready to give answer to those who have questions about the faith. First and foremost, you've got to live a holy life. But also you've got to have some answers. But your answers are real easy. They have to be grounded in one thing. So, I want you to imagine something. I want you to imagine a line that starts here at my shoulder. And it goes up through the ceiling, and through the clouds, and out through the stars. And it starts right here. I want you to imagine a second line. Also starts right here, but it goes this way through the earth, to the other side of the earth, and out through the stars that way. Both lines keep going and they never end. Both start at one point here. This point here, if I had a piece of paper I'd show you, but it's much, much, much thinner than my phone. It's much thinner than a sheet of paper. That thickness of that sheet of paper is actually the length time of your life if you lived 100 years. And in that short span you decide where you're going to go for all eternity on one of two paths. You know, when you write a test, when you write an exam that means a lot, to get into the program you want to graduate, to finish your dissertation, to enter a job that you've always wanted, and you start that test and you're on the clock, you're not going to sign your name and then say, you know, I can take a little snooze now, I've got like an hour. You're going to try your hardest to maximize that use of time, that precious gift of that one small hour, to fulfill the goal that you want for the rest of your life. Except we're not talking about the rest of your life, we're talking about eternity. And that's the perspective you need to have to understand how to give proper answers to the hardest questions on faith, life, and family. I'm going to give you that same perspective from an atheist. There's a really famous atheist called Penn Jillette. Back 100 years ago, on TV, he used to have a show called Penn and Teller. There were two anti-Catholics on a TV show, and they were really ruthless against the faith. No one in the room except for the older people will remember Penn and Teller, right? Anybody? Penn and Teller? Oh, some of you, look at that. All right, so Penn Jillette in 2008, he said this: if you believe there's a heaven and a hell, and that people could be going to hell or not getting eternal life or whatever, and you think it's not really worth telling them this because it would make it socially awkward, how much do you have to hate somebody not to proselytize? How much do you have to hate somebody to believe eternal life is possible and not tell them that? We hear a lot about how we're not supposed to proselytize, sometimes from quarters that should never say such things, and yet we know the truth is it's about deciding where we go. We have to proselytize. Proselytize doesn't mean trying to force people in. Obviously, use every means at your disposal, chiefly your holiness, to bring people to eternal life. Well, these three kids knew that truth very well. The children of Fatima were given that right in the beginning. And they were given, first, a vision of hell. Do you remember that? Isn't that funny? Our Lady started with that. Because Our Lady was warning them for our times. I guarantee you she was warning them for our times, because look at this. What'd she say about hell after the kids saw it? More souls go to hell because of sins of the flesh than any other reason. She also said fashions will be introduced that will offend our Lord very much. She also added, by the way, woe to women lacking in modesty. Isn't that funny? 1917, and more souls go to hell because of sins of the flesh than any other reason. Saints, Lucia, but also others, when they saw hell, described souls falling into hell like snowflakes. If it was snowflakes, in 1917, it is a blizzard today. A lot of people say something funny. Oh, you know, we've had worse times in the past. Oh, you don't know about the scandals of history. There may be some truth to that, but I'm telling you, there's a lot of falsehood in that. One way you know is simply by this statement. If Our Lady said in 1917, more people go to hell because of sins of the flesh than any other reason. Flesh is obviously impurity, as Lucia said over and over. They didn't even have the internet back then. They didn't have the P word. They didn't have all of those things. In fact, you know what? Even population-wise, it was weird, because there's more people who regularly view porn nowadays than there are people who were alive in 1917. We've got a problem with our math. There's another common, very, very common error today, a very common saying that totally negates so much of what we try to do when living our faith. Bring people to heaven and keep them from hell. And that notion is said by prelates in the church, the highest ranking prelates even. And that's that really nobody goes to hell. I mean, if even there's some prelates who are asked, you know, what if they really don't want to go to heaven? Well, then they're annihilated. Things like this. Well, that makes our Lord a liar. Father already said it this morning, Matthew 13 and 14, Jesus says, enter in at the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction. Wait, and many there are that go in. He said, narrow is the gate and straight the way that leads to life, and few there are that find it. This is Jesus, not anybody else. So this is serious business. If hell is eternal punishment forever and heaven eternal bliss forever, we don't want that for anybody. And this has to be our mission. I'm going to give you some of the answers to what used to be the hardest questions. The hardest questions, back in my day when I was your age, were always the same. A little bit before me even, it was always the abortion questions. I'm going to deal with the hardest of my day's question, which is now slapping us all in the face, and of course that's the question around homosexuality. Everybody now says, used to say back then too, these two guys are gay and love one another, why can't they get married? You're just a hater and a bigot. Why are you against love? The answer is actually rather simple. The first answer, the most simple, is I don't want them to go to hell. Now, I wouldn't start there, but I would mention that, because when you hide that, as often people do, people know where you're coming from, and when you're not saying that. But don't say it in a way that's harmful and hurtful. Say it in a way that's honestly caring, because you really don't want people to go there. But one of the things you can say first is, this behavior harms you, harms your body, harms your mind. Look at all the stats, look at all the studies. LifeSite News is full of research about the harms of homosexual acts. And it's all there for you to read, study after study, medical journal after medical journal, testimony after testimony of people who were in the lifestyle and left. But often you'll get the response, oh yeah, those are biased studies. Of course, that's not a very intelligent response, considering most of the journals are biased the other way, if you will. But nevertheless, that's a response. So I've taken actually to saying, okay, don't believe me. Don't believe the studies, even though that's kind of weird. Why don't you believe the gay activists themselves? You see, I'm from Canada, and we passed same-sex marriage in 2005. And in 2009, one of the leading gay activists of the country went to the government to ask for health care dollars. And here is his quotes. This is from the leading homosexual magazine in Canada called Extra. Jens Hellquist was the name of the leader. He said, one of the We have one of the poorest health statuses in this country. Health issues affecting queer Canadians include lower life expectancy than the average Canadian, suicide, higher rates of substance abuse, depression, inadequate access to care, and HIV/AIDS. He said there are all kinds of health issues that are endemic to our community. We have higher rates of anal cancer in the gay male community. Lesbians have higher rates of breast cancer. I'm going to skip a bit there, but he said, now that we can get married, everyone assumes that we don't have any issues anymore. A lot of the deaths that occur in our community are hidden. We don't see them, but those of us working on the front lines see them, and I'm tired of watching my community die. This behavior is harmful just from a medical perspective, just from a psychological, psychiatric perspective. The stats are real, the studies are out there, and even the activists on the other side admit it when they're asking for health care. But this is the thing, we've become accustomed to not saying this. How loving is it for a parent not to tell their child that they shouldn't touch a fire when it's there? Are they being nice to them and accepting and welcoming to do that? No. They're being irresponsible and, in fact, in scriptural terms, hateful. Remember the scripture? You don't discipline your child, you hate your child. The church has known this. The church taught this. In 1986, then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger put out a document from the CDF that talked about this. It was an instruction to the bishops of the Catholic Church, and it forbade silence on the issue. I'm going to read you part of it. It said, "We wish to make it clear that departure from the Church's teaching," and then what teaching is that if you look at the line above, clearly stating that homosexual activity is immoral, departure from the Church's teaching or silence about it in an effort to provide pastoral care is neither caring nor pastoral. Only what is true can ultimately be pastoral, and the neglect of the Church's position prevents homosexual men and women from receiving the care they need and deserve. So, neglect of the Church's teaching or silence about it in an effort to provide pastoral care is neither caring nor pastoral. The Church has taught this. Nowadays, beyond homosexuality, there's the issue of transgenderism. Transgenderism is another challenge, a related one, obviously. But I want to show you, instead of talking about it myself, one clip that in 2 minutes answers this question better than probably we ever could have without it. And this clip is from Dr. Cretella, and I'm going to let her speak for herself, and hopefully the audio plays.
Essentially, transgender ideology holds that people can be born into the wrong body. It's simply not true. Human sexuality is binary. We know this because in nature, reproduction is a rule. And human beings engage in sexual reproduction. You need a man and a woman to do that. Women are XX, that is sex chromosomes. Women have two X's. Men have an X and a Y. Those are genetic markers. They're genetic markers for female and male, respectively. Okay, binary. That's the rule, and it's self-evident. Transgender, someone who identifies as transgender, however, that's not a problem in their body. Gender identity, all identities, they're in our thoughts. Thoughts and feelings, those are not hardwired, they develop, and they may be factually wrong or factually correct. The definition of a delusion is a fixed false belief. So if I consistently insist that I'm Margaret Thatcher, or consistently insist that I'm a cat, or I'm an amputee trapped in a normal body, I am delusional. And in fact, there are people who believe they are amputees trapped in a normal body. They are appropriately diagnosed as having body identity integrity disorder. If you want to cut off an arm or a leg, you're mentally ill. But if you want to cut off healthy breasts and genitals, then basically a civil right to mental illness. There's no such thing as a civil right to mental illness. But that is in fact what we are dealing with this transgender rights movement.
Did you catch that? If you want to chop off an arm or a leg, healthy limbs, it's a mental disorder. If you want to chop off genitalia, you're transgendered. It's something great and wonderful that we should all pay for with our healthcare dollars. And this is the society we live in. I'm going to go really quickly through the old arguments that you should all know. And that is, every time you're asked about abortion, you're always asked about the first thing first. Rape and incest. Not like, no attention, that doesn't account for hardly any of the abortions, but nonetheless, we have to be willing and able to give an answer. And my answer is always the same one. I will start with this line, which comes from an African-American lady on a picket line, probably praying a rosary. She said, if you're going to kill somebody, why don't you start with the guilty rapist before the innocent child? That line cuts right to the quick. Oh my gosh. If you're going to kill somebody, start with the guilty rapist before the innocent child. Because it's true, we're dealing with that. Another line I use is, I know a lot of women actually, I happen to be in the movement, so you get to meet all the women, the beautiful women from Silent No More, who will tell you they had an abortion, many of whom were raped. And they'll tell you, I could get over the rape because it was done to me. But the abortion's been much harder because I did that to my child. Why are we harming the women who have already been harmed by abortion? Already been harmed by rape with abortion? Another famous line, how dare you as a man tell me what I can do with my body? And I was asked this question actually by a woman in a picket line picketing a pro-life conference. And I said, look, this won't work for all of you obviously, but I said, look, as a person of color, I'm against discrimination. And when I was a kid, I was picked on because I wasn't white. But I'm against discrimination, yeah, based on race, but also based on size and age. And yep, the kid in the womb is really, really small. And he's really, really, really young. But I've got a 2-year-old, and he's small, and he's young. He's worth no less than me because he's small and young. These arguments we have to have with us so as to bring people's reason close to the faith. But as I said, those are the easy things. If you want to do a fun thing, you can back to that argument of how it was so much worse in olden days. If you count up all the military deaths in the United States history, you come to like 1.5 million. Look at the yearly abortion stats. From 1983, 1.5 million, all the way to 2012, where you see only 1 million. Are we getting better? No. These don't count medical abortions, which have skyrocketed. But let me go to Our Lady's final prophecy. And this is, in the end, my immaculate heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, and she, that being Russia, shall be converted, and a period of peace will be granted to the world. Where's the peace? And where's Russia's conversion? She warned that if we don't, Russia would spread her errors throughout the earth. What errors? Pope Benedict said something very interesting, even after they said, oh, it's all finished, it's all done, Fatima complete, finished, gone. He said something on the plane in 2011 when going to celebrate an anniversary of Fatima, and he said these words. An indication is given of realities involving the future of the church, which are gradually taking shape and becoming evident. He was talking about the third secret. As for the new things which we can find in this message, the third secret today, we are seeing it in a really terrifying way that the greatest persecution of the church comes not from her enemies without, but arises from sin within the church. you remember his homily right before he became Pope, he talked about the filth in the church. As Father read yesterday, Our Lady of Akita warned about it. The work of the devil will infiltrate even into the church in such a way that one will see cardinals opposing cardinals, bishops against bishops. And all of that is going on today. She said, "To prevent this, I shall come to ask for the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart, communion of reparation on the first Saturdays. If my requests are heeded, Russia will be converted and there will be peace. If not, she will spread her errors through the world, causing wars, persecutions of the church. The good will be martyred, the Holy Father will have much to suffer, and various nations will be annihilated." We're experiencing all of that now. More martyrdoms than ever before in history. The Holy Father suffering like never before, a lot due to his own situation. We've not yet seen nations annihilated. But what errors of Russia will be spread? Everybody thinks communism. Yeah, that alternate thing to capitalism that really doesn't sound that bad. Well, no, actually. As Father mentioned this more, as Kevin mentioned just before the talk, Russia was the first to legalize abortion in 1920. Still today has one of the highest abortion rates in the world. Its population is really small compared to America, and while in America there's about 1 million abortions a year, they have 1.2 million with half your population. The Naked Communist is a book by Cleon Skousen, an ex-FBI agent. And very interestingly, you guys should know about this. Reagan talked about this book, about Cleon Skousen, as no one better qualified to discuss the threat to this nation from communism. It was so important it was read into the congressional record. In that book, he describes the goals of communism. I'm going to read some of these, and then think to yourself if Russia has actually spread her errors. And are we seeing them today still, or is it maybe a thing of the past, all done because it's all been finished? Eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech and free press. Break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. Present homosexuality, degeneracy, promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. Infiltrate the churches and replace revealed religion with social religion. Discredit the Bible and emphasize the need for intellectual maturity, which does not need a religious crutch. Eliminate prayer or any phase of religious expression in the schools on the grounds that it violates the principle of separation of church and state. Discredit the family as an institution. Encourage promiscuity, masturbation, and easy divorce. Emphasize the need to raise children away from the negative influence of parents. Attribute prejudices, mental blocks, retarding of children to suppressive influence of parents. When this came out, I have to tell you, it was thought to be, well, that'll never happen. That's the most extreme thing I've ever heard of. Today, that's all normal. Is anybody shocked by any of this? Does one single thing on this list stand out as, no, that's impossible, that'll never happen, that's not going on now? Of course not. We're living that. That's total reality. So how do we tell our friends one of the answers to one of the hardest questions? Well, everybody says Russia's already consecrated. Why are you praying for the consecration of Russia anymore? Don't you believe that John Paul II did it in 1984? I have the answer for you. The answer for you comes from one of the greatest church leaders in the church today, Raymond Cardinal Burke. At the conference we organized in Rome, called the Rome Life Forum, in 2012, Cardinal Burke said these words. And these are the words we should all be using. Regarding the consecration of Russia, the Immaculate Heart of Mary, I do not doubt for a moment the intention of Pope St. John Paul II to carry out the consecration on March 25th, 1984. The servant of God at the time, Sister Maria Lucia of Jesus and the Immaculate Heart, indicated that Our Lady had accepted it. But it is evident that the consecration was not carried out in the manner requested by Our Lady. Recognizing the necessity of a total conversion from atheistic materialism and communism to Christ, the call of Our Lady of Fatima to consecrate Russia to her Immaculate Heart, in accord with her explicit instruction, remains urgent. These are hard questions indeed, which we have to answer. We have to be ready to answer. But unfortunately, there are much, 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 much harder ones today. And so before I go into the really, really, really hard ones, I'm going to tell you two things. One, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. Remember how we talked about more people addicted to porn today than there were alive in 1917? There's more sin around. Therefore, there's also more grace around. It's therefore your asking. A priest friend of mine told an amazing story. He said basically he was getting word from Canada. So how many are Canadians here, by the way? Oh, a good number. So you'll all get the hockey joke. So this is a hockey story. For all you Americans, I apologize, but we're all into hockey over there. So priest friend says, he watched a hockey game and his team had made it to the playoffs. That's the end of, I know, I'm just kidding. So his team had made it to the playoffs and they had really struggled. And before he was able to get his beer and popcorn and sit down, the opposing team already had scored a goal. And he was late from Mass and confessions after Mass. And he was like, oh. Anyway, sits down. Same period, 2 more goals lost, end of the period. It's like, oh. He explains to me how each goal seemed like a stab in the heart. Like they had been working all this time and had done so well. And they're just losing it. Second period, his team lost 4 more goals. And he felt like he was dead. He was going to turn it off, but he was a Catholic, so he was offering up and said, suffering is good. In the third period, they actually tied it up. They rallied and tied it up. And they won in overtime. He was elated beyond words, but he told me that some 20 years later, he was watching the best of games on the NHL. And he said, he sat down and he noticed, oh my gosh, they're playing my game. They were airing the full game. And you know what he said? He said he could watch the first period with all those scores, losses, second period with all those losses, in great joy and peace, because he knew that his team would win in the end. And he said to me, we are going through hell right now in the church. But we know in the end, her immaculate heart will triumph. So we can watch these sorrows right now, which is the crucifixion of Christ's body on earth, with peace and even with a joy, because we know in the end, her immaculate heart will triumph. In order to, and we're now pausing for a commercial break, in order to stay on top of this, we actually developed a magazine. It's not for all of you, I know, you're all on the internet. But your parents need to learn about this, your aunts and uncles, and Christmas is coming up. So we created a magazine 3 years ago now, which catalogs the nightmare that I'm going to talk to you about in a second. It's a Vatican news magazine, created so that especially the hierarchy can pay attention to what's going on. Because believe it or not, often they don't. And it's crucial to do so, because you are going to get questioned on this. And these will be the hardest questions. I want you to know that some prelates in the church recognize the problems. These are quotes from Cardinal Sarah. On March 31st, he's the head of the Congregation for Divine Worship and Discipline of the Sacraments. He said there's a serious crisis of faith, not only at the level of the Christian faithful, but also and especially among priests and bishops. He said today a significant number of the church leaders underestimate the serious crisis that the church is going through. Relativism in doctrinal, moral, and disciplinary teaching, grave abuses in the desacralization and trivialization of the sacred liturgy. He said on April 18th, without a common faith, the church is threatened by confusion, and then progressively she can slide into dispersion and schism. Today there's a grave risk of fragmentation of the church, breaking up of the mystical body of Christ by insisting on the national identities of the churches and thus on their capacity to decide for themselves, above all, in the so-called domain of doctrine and morals. In his book, The Power of Silence, he said, something like an earthquake is seeking to demolish the church's doctrinal foundation and her centuries-old moral teachings. Cardinal Caffarra, great cardinal, one of the four Dubia cardinals who passed away, he said, only a blind man could deny there's a great confusion and uncertainty and insecurity in the church. Again, it was predicted, as I said earlier, by Our Lady of Akita, so this isn't new. It was also, believe it or not, predicted by Joseph Ratzinger, when he was Father Joseph Ratzinger still, in 1976. He said, the church will become small and have to start afresh, more or less from the beginnings. He talked about not being able to inhabit many of the edifices, the buildings. Because what's coming now is very scary indeed. We've had the Pennsylvania grand jury, the Attorney General's report, and it was devastating. Remember what this is talking about, though. This is talking about old abuses of minors. It's ignoring a huge amount of abuse of seminarians. Nevertheless, it created a tidal wave such that it opened up. You know that New Jersey and New York are also going to do investigations, and attorney generals also in Illinois, Missouri, Nebraska, New Mexico have also said they're going to do these investigations. As the fathers have talked about privately at tables here, it's already hard to be looked at as a priest. As Father said in his homily this morning, become a priest with all those pedophiles? Because that is the public perception. We know these holy priests, and the suffering that they have to go through because of what's going on is very real indeed. But you as Catholics will also experience it, because you will be asked by your friends, why are you in that weird cult full of pedophiles? This isn't going to be an uncommon question in a very little while. And you have to be able to give answer. What I'm going to say now, I want to give a little proviso, and that's in canon law, the faithful have a right, indeed at times a duty, in keeping with their knowledge, competence, and position, to manifest to the sacred pastor their views on matters which concern the good of the church. They have a right also to make their views known to others of Christ's faithful, but in doing so they must always respect the integrity of the faith and morals, show reverence to the pastors, and take into account both the common good and the dignity of individuals. St. Thomas Aquinas said similarly. He said, if the faith were endangered, a subject ought to rebuke his prelate even publicly. Hence Paul, who was Peter's subject, rebuked him in public on account of the imminent danger of scandal concerning the faith. And, as the gloss of St. Augustine says, Peter gave example to superiors that if at any time they should happen to stray from the straight path, they should not disdain to be reproved by their subjects. All that is by way of prelude to what I'm going to show you. And I hope it's not a shock to many of you, because probably many of you know most of this, I hope. But you should know it, because it pertains to the faith, and we need to see it in order to know how to answer to it. If you paid close attention, closer than I was, and I paid pretty close attention, on the balcony when Pope Francis was elected, you would have seen a certain individual cardinal by the name of Gottfried Daniels. He's a very controversial cardinal. This is him. Because, and I hope, by the way, I don't mean controversial because he's wearing a rainbow sash and is okay with gay marriage. And I don't mean controversial because he told the King of Belgium that it was okay to legalize abortion. I don't even mean, well, yes, I do mean. I mean, he's controversial because on this issue of sex abuse, he was the cardinal caught telling a sex abuse victim that he shouldn't go public with the testimony. He said, you know what? The bishop is retiring next year. Be quiet. Look to your own sins. The victim, by the way, was actually the nephew of that other bishop who abused him. And he taped the conversation with Cardinal Daniels and made that tape public. But nevertheless, Cardinal Daniels was on the balcony with Pope Francis. The Vatican has become a sort of place for population control conferences going on all the time, including, believe it or not, led by or featuring the head, the father of population control, Paul Ehrlich, actually speaking at the Vatican. We actually interviewed him when he was going to speak there. And he told us that actually he was really pleased with the direction Pope Francis was taking the church. This is the head of the Pontifical Academy for Life, Bishop Paglia, and he's a very controversial figure because if you remember in Poland, I have pictures of it, but I wouldn't show them here. He put out a sex ed program on behalf of the Vatican that is so salacious, it's disgusting. It has images in there that I would never, ever show to my kids. So something is deeply wrong in the church, but it shouldn't be surprising. Bishop Paglia should have been known. In fact, when he was in his cathedral in Terni, he had a huge mural painted on the wall of Jesus, the fisherman, holding up 2 nets. The nets are full of naked people, homosexuals, transvestites, etc., etc. Totally intentional. In fact, in the image, Jesus himself is wearing a translucent garb, and you can see genitalia underneath. He put that image across from the tabernacle, and it's huge. It's a huge mural on the wall. Here's part of it, actually, because he had himself painted in there. That's him, embracing the nude man. This is the weirdest stuff going on in our beloved church. But it's not even so simple. September 19th, 2013, Pope Francis said, "We cannot insist only on issues related to abortion, gay marriage, and the use of contraceptive methods. It's not possible. I've not spoken about these things, much about these things, and I was reprimanded for that. But when we speak about these issues, we have to speak about them in a context. The teaching of the church, for that matter, is clear. I'm a son of the church, but it's not necessary to talk about these issues all the time." How many of you are Catholic? How many of you go to, and it's not fair to say if you're going to these guys' masses, but let's say when you went to the last Novus Ordo Mass you went to, how many of you in any Novus Ordo Mass have ever heard a homily on contraception? Hand up. Okay, on abortion. Come on, it has to be some. Okay. On homosexual marriage. Something's wrong with this calculus. How can the Holy Father say that we can't talk about these issues all the time? It's very strange indeed. In fact, it's very strange also because Pope John Paul II said, "To be truly a people at the service of life, we must propose these truths constantly and courageously from the very first proclamation of the gospel." So something is strange indeed. In fact, very strange, because Pope Francis met with the chief of abortion in all of Italy. In fact, he called her one of the nation's forgotten greats. On February 8th, 2016, in an interview with the leading paper there, Corriere della Sera, he said of Emma Bonino, she's one of the nation's forgotten greats. He's met with her several times, actually. He compared her to Konrad Adenauer. And it's bizarre because not only was Emma Bonino an illegal abortionist who did like 10,000 abortions herself, and there's gross pictures on the internet, which I won't show you, but are available, of her doing one. She's not repentant. In fact, after fleeing the country because she thought she'd get arrested, she came back, became a politician, legalized abortion, same-sex marriage, and most anti-church things, just like every liberal politician in America. But the Pope nevertheless regards her, there she is, meeting with the Pope, as one of the nation's greats, and she actually goes on speaking tours in Catholic churches in Italy because she's got this recognition from the Pope. Why does the Pope like her so much? Because he feels that she's doing good things on immigration. Do you remember when the Pope came to America? At the time, there was a big deal going on with Kim Davis because she was arrested. She was a county clerk from Kentucky, refused to sign the papers or allow her signature to be on the papers for same-sex marriages because she was a Christian. She was an evangelical Christian. She had kids. She went to jail for that refusal. When the Pope came, the nuncio, a certain Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, who we'll get to later, brought Kim Davis in to see the Pope. And when that happened, they said she couldn't take any photos. The Vatican always takes photos when you meet the Pope. And the Vatican wouldn't release the photos. She went and said that she had met the Pope, and the media went nuts. And yet the Vatican was asked, and they said, no comment. So the media started calling her a liar. Now, Kim Davis's lawyer happened to be at the meeting. So when they started to make some noise, the Vatican said, well, fine, it was a meeting. But it was the only real audience that the Pope gave was with a former student and his family. This was pro forma. This was, the nuncio brought a bunch of people through. This was very sad. Why? Because that former student and his family is Yayo Grassi. His family was, yes, his mother and his sister, and also his homosexual lover. And you know what? They had photo and video. You can watch the video online, but here's part of the photo. There's Yayo Grassi up in the top left-hand side of your screen, and there's the Pope embracing his homosexual partner. On October 2nd, 2016, on a flight to Rome, the Pope referred to a woman who felt like a man but was physically a young woman. And after a sex change surgery in her 20s, the Pope said, he got married. He wrote me a letter saying that for him it would be a consolation to come see me with his wife, the Pope said. These are direct quotes from the Pope. I received them and they were very happy. Clarifying his use of pronouns, the Pope said, he, that was her, but is he. If you don't believe the words of the Pope, here's the photo of the Pope with the lesbian couple, one of whom, on your right there, is a woman. Remember what Dr. Bertella said. Biologically, she's a woman. Now, she's taken drugs. She's had an operation to mutilate her body, taken drugs to further do so she's growing facial hair. But nevertheless, this is the situation we're dealing with. Pope Francis in June 2016 said, in Argentina's northeastern countryside, couples have had a child and live together. They have a civil wedding. So they live together, and he's talking about Catholics, by the way. They have a civil wedding when the child goes to school. So get this, they're living together, have a child. They have a civil wedding when the child goes to school. And when they become grandparents, then they get married religiously. Here's what he said of that. It's a superstition because marriage frightens the husband. It's a superstition we have to overcome. Yet, he said, I've seen a lot of fidelity in these cohabitations. I am sure that this is a real marriage and they have the grace of a real marriage because of their fidelity. This went all across CNN before I could get to it. I know because I was in a car shop madly trying to write this up, and out it came on CNN. I got a call from my daughter, who was 20 at the time, from college. She said, Dad, is it true that the Pope said cohabitation is real marriage and has the grace of real marriage? And I've asked several cardinals since then, was I supposed to lie to my daughter? Here's a tweet from Antonio Spadaro. Antonio Spadaro is the most celebrated interviewer of the Pope. He's the one who heads up Civiltà Cattolica, which is the Jesuit magazine out of Rome, copied in the United States through America Magazine and all over the world in different Jesuit publications. But Antonio Spadaro is known as the Pope's ghostwriter. He is very influential and a close advisor to the Pope. Here's his own tweet. Tweet of the Pope with this couple coming up holding hands, and it says, the welcoming of those young people who prefer to live together without getting married. This is so harmful for us. This is so deadly for us, so deadly for the faith. Here's a photo of that former nuncio, Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, who's probably the most heroic prelate in the church today. This is Steve Jelsovac, actually, is there on the left hand, on the right hand, on your right hand side of the screen. And Archbishop Vigano gave us his testimony, which got then shared all around the world. It was an amazing thing to out what is happening. Do you remember his explanation as to why he did what he did? Was it because I hate the Pope and I want to get him? No. It was because I'm an old man and I want to be able to give account to Christ for my life. There's something that you have to understand, and it relates exactly to what we were talking about originally, and that is to the truth of those two lines. That's the perspective to answering all the hardest questions. In Matthew 18:6, you read this very simple quote. It talks about how, Jesus' own words, "It would be better for you to have a millstone tied about your neck and be thrown into the sea than you mislead these little ones, and that you give scandal." And that is the key. When you realize that the Holy Father's own soul is in peril, you know the answer of what to do about it if you love him. Remember what the Vatican's instructions said about homosexual persons? It is wrong to avoid the church's teaching and be silent about it. It's wrong to do that because that shows no love. In fact, it shows hate if you take it biblically. So what's to do? Well, Bishop Schneider told us what's to do. He said, the true friends of the Pope are those cardinals and bishops and laymen who express their public concern about these very important issues, about the state of confusion in the church. They are really the friends of the Pope. He called the concerns and calls for clarity an act of charity toward the Pope. He added that he was convinced that when the Pope faces his judgment before God, he will be thankful to those cardinals, bishops, and lay people who called on him to offer clarity. This is what we're doing. If you love the Pope, and you should love the Pope, you need to pray for him daily, you need to offer sacrifices and sufferings for him, and you need to speak publicly even about these things, because you have to defend the faith, and the faith is being confused from the highest levels. I'm going to end off with a little story that I just heard. Some of you probably heard it too. A really neat priest, the version I heard, didn't have a title on his name because he is giving a homily, but it sounds pretty scary. A lot of you are young enough to remember your teenage years. And especially guys, but I'll just pick on my own sex because I know them better. Remember when Mom said, clean the room, clean your room, clean your room. About a week, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 2 months into that, you look out your hallway and you hear clump, clump, clump. There's Mom coming with a garbage can and buckets, claws, and you go, oh no! And you vacate your premises because Dad's there to back her up, and you're like, oh, you might even cry because you know you're going to lose everything and it's going to be horrible. After it's all done, though, you come back to your room and you go, oh, wow. First of all, there's a floor. And secondly, this is amazing. I never knew it could be like this. And that smell, it's awesome. I could actually bring friends in my room. It would be weird. But that's what's happening. This hell that we seem to be living through in the church is our mother coming down the hall to clean. And it will be painful. And it might be a great suffering for us. But only after the crucifixion comes the resurrection. This is a quote from the Catechism, believe it or not. Catechism of the Catholic Church, the new one. Number 675, before Christ's second coming, the church must pass through a final trial that will shake the faith of many believers. The persecution that accompanies her pilgrimage on earth will unveil the mystery of iniquity in the form of a religious deception offering men an apparent solution to their problems at the price of apostasy from the truth. The church will enter the glory of the kingdom only through this final Passover, when she will follow her Lord in his death and resurrection. The kingdom will be fulfilled then not by a historic triumph of the church through a progressive ascendancy, but only by God's victory over the final unleashing of evil, which will cause his bride to come down from heaven. In the end, her Immaculate Heart will triumph. We know that. We can watch the sufferings and endure them with that knowledge, with the grace of God that is there for the asking. Why? Because where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. May God bless you.